Hi everyone. So today what we're going to be doing is we are just going to be covering the specific topic that we had allocated for this week's Learning from Home program, and that is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So far in chapter 5, we've been looking at all the different ways people develop, the different theories that were proposed to explain development. We even looked at like how attachment, for example, from a young age can influence your later development. And so developmental psychology has been a big, area of psychology for a long time. And today we're going to be starting a new theory, and this is called Piaget's theory. Okay, Piaget is the guy who basically came up with this theory. It's a very old theory called the theory of cognitive development. So basically, in a nutshell, what this theory basically will discuss is it's talking about the way in which our cognitive abilities develop or basically change as we get older. So we start off being able to have very basic cognitive ability, and then as we get older, we are able to think in more complex ways. Okay, so just before we start the first slide, I just want to direct your attention to this photo on this first slide here, the photo of the boy with the water in the different stages of his life. So when he was really in the early part of his life, just a baby, he could hold a glass of water, okay, and he could probably know that, okay, this is kind of liquidy, it's kind of like, it's not like all the other solid things that I've touched or that I've eaten before. So that's really basic knowledge of water. In the preoperational stage, which we will discuss in depth in a little while, this boy is a little older, so he's between the ages of 2 to 7. So now he's got a little bit of a more complex understanding of water. So he can understand that water can actually form droplets, and that droplets are just one way in which we can represent water. He probably also knows that water can be frozen and turned into ice cubes at this point. In the concrete operational stage, which is stage 3, he's a bit older now. He's almost reaching his teenage years, so 7 to 11. He can probably understand that he can have 250 mils of water and he can pour that into 2 different containers which are shaped differently but will still hold the same amount of water. Okay, so that's again kind of more complex thinking. In the formal operational stage, that's like the stage that is the most complex. Okay, so obviously he is able to think about water as being an abstract concept. So he can think of a glass as being half empty or half full, and that can really determine his kind of mindset. So is he more optimistic and positive of a thinker, or is he more of a negative thinker who always thinks that things are half empty? Okay, so obviously just a really general example here, but just want you guys to get an idea of what the context of this topic is and where we're really trying to come from in terms of a background for this topic, okay? It's simply a theory that talks about how our cognitive abilities of thinking, planning, manipulating information get better or get more complex as we get older, okay? And that obviously a person who doesn't show the expected thinking abilities, as this theory suggests, for their age group might be considered to be a bit delayed or a little bit behind in terms of their cognitive development. Okay, so that's what today's topic will be about. So obviously the name of this theory is the cognitive theory of cognitive development, and we know that the guy who developed this theory was Jean Piaget. So Jean Piaget was basically a child psychologist. He was very interested in how children develop, specifically with reference to their thinking skills, so their ability to think and cognitively and mentally process information. Now, before we go into the actual stages of Piaget's theory and what happens at what age group and etc., it's important for us to understand the key principles of Piaget's theory. And they are adaptation, assimilation, accommodation, and schema. Okay, so these are the these are the 4 different principles of Piaget's theory. So if I ever ask you in a SAC to identify the 4 principles of Piaget's theory, you should be able to name these 4 principles. Now we're going to look at definitions for these principles, and I'll explain them a bit more in the next slide. So obviously in this next slide, we are just trying to define these key principles. You shouldn't have a in-depth understanding of them, but at least a basic understanding of them is enough. Okay, you should be able to differentiate, okay, how is a schema different from assimilation? How is the process of accommodation different from adaptation? Okay, now you'll notice that just before I go through these definitions and descriptions, there's an extra principle on this slide called equilibration. You don't need to know what equilibration is, okay? I've just put it there in case you come across it on Edrollo or on some other online resource, but for the SAC, you only need to know the first four. So what is a schema? A schema sounds like a confusing concept, but honestly, a schema is just a mental structure. And that mental structure gives the child a model for what happens when he or she does something. So if this little baby in this first picture here, in this cartoon, is to take the glass and smash it against the bench top or smash it against its high chair, what will actually happen to the glass is that it will break. Okay, that's what happens when he smashes the glass against the high chair. It will break. So that's a schema. It's a mental structure, and it gives the child an idea of what's going to happen when he or she manipulates a particular item. Okay, if there's a little if this little baby's brothers or sisters are playing with a ball, and that ball is rolling around, the child might notice that when it touches the ball kind of rolls away from the baby, okay? And so then the baby will develop a schema for that particular object or a specific mental structure for what happens when it touches a ball. The ball will often roll away, okay? So things can smash, things can roll away, things can, bounce. Again, it really depends on what object the baby is trying to manipulate. So that's the schema. It's the mental structure, okay? It's important for children, especially when they're babies, to understand what happens when they manipulate or work with certain objects, because it gives them that expectation then that, okay, if it's glass, I can't really bounce my mother's glass vase like I can bounce like a little bouncy ball, okay? So basically, it's important for kids to remember that schemas do provide the expectations of how they should behave with a particular object. The next thing is assimilation. So assimilation is when we add information to an existing schema. So, for example, a lot of babies, when they're born, in order for them to stop crying, or even some babies think of it as a comforting technique, a lot of babies have little pacifiers or dummies, okay? And they usually suck on the dummy to make them feel better or more comfortable. And it also helps in terms of, making them more quiet. And some of them find it comfortable because it works with the reflexes they already have in terms of, basically promoting that development of, ability to, chew particular objects later on when they come onto solid foods. So how assimilation might work is that a child might have a specific dummy that's in a specific shape. But if the mother's like, oh God, all of those are out of stock because of Corona, I've got to buy this brand now, that new brand of dummy might be a different shape. Okay, but the baby, because it's so used to just sucking a dummy when it's given the dummy or when it's given the pacifier, it can then assimilate. It can then kind of learn to get used to this new dummy, even though it is a different shape and it is a different brand from the original dummy. So assimilation is simply adding information to an existing schema, okay? So to an existing mental structure. And in the process of that, you're learning more about that mental structure. So this baby's now learned that, hey, there's not just one type of dummy in the world or one type of pacifier. There are many different types and brands of pacifiers, okay? The next type of key principle, or the next key principle in Piaget's theory, is accommodation. Accommodation is when we change an existing schema to suit a new situation. So, for example, if the child knows that smashing the glass, it can't just smash the glass against the high chair like it smashes its little soft toy. That then becomes a way that the baby accommodates an existing schema. Okay, so basically, it's taking something you already know and putting it into a new situation. And adaptation is basically the way the baby adapts or adjusts to the process of assimilation and accommodation. Okay, so both of these processes and the way the baby kind of adjusts to both of these processes. So adaptation is kind of influenced by assimilation and accommodation at the same time. Equilibration, I'm not going to go through that because we don't really need it, but it's more to do with the effect of the environment and biological changes that are occurring to the baby. For example, the baby's growing physically, its face structure is changing, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so Piaget's theory can be confusing for a lot of students because I guess the concepts that are discussed in Piaget's theory can be quite abstract or hard to visualize or imagine. So this is just a little bit more of a visual example to help you understand what accommodation is. So let's say that there's a little girl and she sees a four-legged animal for the first time. She sees a cow, basically. Okay? So she's gone on a family trip, they've gone to a farm, and this is the first time she's seen the cow, okay? So obviously, because the cow has four legs, and the girl has a little puppy at home that also has four legs, and she calls that puppy maybe doggy or puppy or whatever. When this girl goes to the farm and sees the cow, she has to work with the existing schemas that she already has. So basically, the only existing knowledge she has of a four-legged animal is that a four-legged animal has four legs, and it's called doggy because that's what she calls the four-legged animal she has at home. So now, rather than calling this animal cow, she's actually calling this animal doggy because that's all she really knows. Okay, she knows that I have a four-legged animal at home. It's got four legs, and I call it doggy. So this new animal, which doesn't really look like my doggy, but also has four legs, is also going to be called doggy. Okay, because both of them have four legs. And although this is really basic knowledge, you have to remember that little kids don't have a lot of exposure to the world. Okay, especially in the early years of life. And so this is one way that they can use what they already know, use what knowledge they already have, and kind of get a better understanding of the world by then generalizing or by accommodating a new object or a new thing into that existing knowledge they have. So the new thing in this case is the cow. So obviously, when the child saw the cow for the first time, she's going to assimilate it to her schema of doggy as a four-legged animal, which means that she's applying some kind of new information to the existing schema. Now, when her mother tells her that, no, sweetie, this is a cow, it's not a doggy, she's then going to accommodate that new information, okay? And will then, from thereafter, refer to that animal as a cow, not a doggy. So, obviously, it's important, in order for cognitive development to actually work and to occur, there has to be someone to correct the child, okay? So if the child says, oh, look at that animal on the farm, that's a doggy, and the mother says, no, that's a cow, the girl then learns from that and learns to include this new word, cow, to also include, to also be incorporated into her knowledge of four-legged animals, okay? So maybe the next time she goes to her friend's house and she sees a cat, the cat has four legs, maybe she's going to call the cat cow. We don't really know, okay? But the more she learns about animals around her, the more she's going to be able to accommodate that new information. So remember, assimilation is when you take old information and you try to apply new information to that. So her already having a doggy at home that has four legs and then trying to make the cow a doggy as well because the cow has four legs. That's assimilation. But when you're learning and when you've learned some new information, remember, you've got to be able to store, you've got to make space, you've got to be able to accommodate that new information. So accommodating new information into your current knowledge is what we call as accommodation. Okay, so assimilation and accommodation are very similar and they kind of interact and they kind of influence one another, but they are still different concepts. So just looking at another visual example that kind of links schema, assimilation, and accommodation, because I really want you guys to be able to differentiate and distinguish between them. So let's say there's a little boy, he's playing with his little toy or rattle or whatever it is. And obviously when kids get their hands on like rattles or these kinds of shaky toys that have like little things in them, what they do is they usually start smashing and banging it all over the house. So they go bang on the table, you know, they go smash on the high chair, smash on every wall they can find. That's a favorite scheme used by babies to explore their world. And you'll notice that a lot of the time, one of the first behaviors you see kids doing is they take any object. They take a TV remote, they'll take a mobile phone, they'll take even maybe something you're eating or drinking, like a drink bottle. And what they'll do is they'll just go and smash or bang it everywhere around the house. They'll just go bang the walls, bang everything, and it's just something, it's a schema or a type of behavior that kids like to engage in with any object they've got around them. Now, the problem with this kind of behavior, though, is that it doesn't work for every object. So yes, it'll work for a little rattle. Yes, it will work for a water bottle. But it will not work with an egg, for example. So in this last image here, you can see the boy has somehow gotten hold of an egg. he's banged it on the kitchen table, or he's banged it across a wall, and what's happened is the egg has broken. So now he's in a bit of trouble. Okay, so obviously the schema has been established in picture A, and in picture B, what we see is assimilation occurs when the child realizes that, hey, my mum bought me a rattle and I can bang that on like a table or a wall, but then I can take my brother's little Lego block, which we see in part B, and I can also use that to like, make noise and kind of bang that on everything that I see and make a lot of trouble there as well. And he might take other things, like I said, like a water bottle, and realize that, yep, he can successfully bang that across every wall in the house and everything's good. But when he takes the egg and bangs that causes a lot of issue, because the egg just breaks. An egg is not supposed to be smashed around or banged around. So what actually happens in assimilation is the boy realizes that other toys or other objects can also be banged, and he starts to incorporate those new objects into this scheme. The scheme here is banging. In accommodation, he realizes that he tried to use a new object, which was an egg, but it did not fit into the scheme. So assimilation, the new object does fit into the scheme and he's happy. In accommodation, the new object did not fit into the scheme, and so now he's learned from this experience. So the next time he sees an egg lying on the bench top, he's not going to pick up the egg and try to bang it or smash it on a table or on a wall, because he knows that the egg will break. So it's kind of like cognitive development in the sense that he's developing his knowledge and his thinking processes around objects that he can and cannot, smash or bang around. Okay, so assimilation is incorporating new objects into your schema. Accommodation is when you realize the new object doesn't fit and you kind of learn from it. So you learn the correct thing that you need to do. So now we're going to be starting with the actual stages of cognitive development that Piaget proposed. So Piaget proposed that at every age range, or stage of a child's life, well into when they became an adult, they would show specific cognitive development in terms of being able to show specific thinking processes or certain behaviors that showed that they were increasing in complexity in terms of their cognitive development, in terms of how they could mentally process information, how they could think, how they could make decisions, how they could deduce certain information. So all of these different cognitive changes and developments that would occur, he actually classed or classified or categorized them into 4 separate stages, which were based on the age of the child. And he actually gave these stages names. And so what we're going to do for the remainder of this PowerPoint is just go through each of these stages and just kind of emphasize the different key changes or key developments that would occur cognitively in each of these stages. So in the sensory motor stage, that's the really early, that's the earliest stage. Okay, so obviously that's from being a newborn to being about 2 years of age. Now, between this time, children will be exploring their environment. Okay, now a lot of people think that babies are really unaware of their environment. They're unaware of what's happening around them. That's actually false, because babies are quite aware of what is happening around them. And they actually learn a lot more than you think they do in these first 2 years of life. So children, usually what they do, you'll notice a lot of newborn kids, the minute they can start to crawl, they will start crawling around, they'll be touching everything, they'll be chewing on everything they find, they'll be shaking things, they'll be rolling things around, whatever is possible in order to manipulate an object. Now, obviously, even though they can't speak, or many children cannot speak at this age, they can still develop those motor skills, okay? So they can still develop those motor skills, and they develop this skill called object permanence, okay? So the 2 key accomplishments, and you should know these for each of the stages, the 2 key cognitive developments or accomplishments that we see in children by the end of the sensory motor stage are object permanence and goal-directed behavior. So goal-directed behavior is basically talking about the fact that the child, if the child wants something or it wants to achieve a goal, it will behave in a way that allows it to reach that goal. Okay, so let's say the baby's favorite little furry toy or little bear, teddy bear or whatever is on the other side of the room. Once the baby sees that, and you might have noticed this with your siblings or your cousins, the baby will start rapidly crawling towards that, all eyes on this furry toy or on the teddy bear, ready to go and grab that teddy bear. That's called goal-directed behavior because the baby has behaved in a way that is consistent with a goal, when that goal in this case is to get the teddy bear. The other key accomplishment that we see in children by the end of 2 years of age is object permanence. Object permanence is this idea that objects are permanent, or they continue to exist even if they can't be touched, even if they can't be smelled, even if they can't be heard, okay? And so a child will realize that just because they leave the room, it doesn't mean their toys in the previous room cease to exist. Their toys in the previous room are still there, and they can still go back to them, okay? And one of the reasons why children that are in the early stages of sensory motor, so very young, maybe 1 or maybe a few months old, the reason why these kids are so amused by peekaboo is because they find it so hilarious that their parents can just cover their eyes and then suddenly disappear. Because for the baby, once the parents cover the eyes, it's like the parent has disappeared because because according to them in the early stages, once the parent covers their eyes, they're no longer there. They don't exist. And then when the parent removes their hands from their eye, it's like, oh my God, suddenly they exist anymore. This is so funny. So object permanence only really works. Object permanence is something that we see developing towards the end of the sensory motor stage. Peekaboo is an example of a game that relies on the child not understanding object permanence. Okay, if you do play peekaboo with a 2-year-old, you realize they're not really amused by it. They're just like, yeah, I kind of know you're still there. Okay, so obviously object permanence is one of the other key accomplishments of the sensory motor stage. So the next stage of Piaget's cognitive theory of development is the preoperational stage. The preoperational stage happens between the ages of 2 to 7 years old. So this is kind of the time when the child is kind of slowly approaching maybe playgroup or childcare or kindergarten and well into school as well. So about the grade 2, grade 1 kind of age. Okay. So obviously, by this point, the child has developed language. They are able to talk. They are able to learn ways to describe things. So they can describe people. They can say, my mum is kind or my dad is brave. Okay. They can describe their feelings as well. So they might say, oh, you know, when my brother screamed at me, that made me angry. That made me sad. Okay. So they begin to also understand symbols. And this is why you see a lot of children in this age playing make-believe. So they might make a little fort out of, like a little cave out of blankets and a pillow or something like that. So this understanding of symbolic thinking or symbolisms becomes apparent in the preoperational stage. Now, obviously, 2 to 7 years of age is still really young, so you can't really think in very abstract ways, okay? I can't ask a 2 to 7 year old, what is the meaning of life? Or what do we mean by a glass being half empty? Okay, it's not going to make sense to them because they're still in that early stage of cognitive development. Now, the key accomplishments for the preoperational stage, which we are going to go into in a little bit more depth in the next 3 slides, are symbolic thinking, transformation, and reversibility. So we'll be going through these in a bit more detail in the next few slides. Now, just before we go through the 3 key accomplishments of preoperational stage, something that we see and which is quite funny actually in the preoperational stage is this concept of egocentrism. So with egocentrism, it's basically, most of you would know what an ego is, and centrism comes from the word central. So egocentrism is this idea that the child that is aged 2 to 7 years old often only views the world from their perspective, and they don't really stop to understand that, hey, this is how other people feel, or hey, this person might not really like what I'm doing. They just believe that if I like something, then everyone must like it too. And this is one of the reasons why children are so excited to do things, and they just are so enthusiastic about it because they think everyone around them is also just as excited as them. So this little speech bubble here says this child is excited to go to the Disney World theme park, and she's pretty excited, but the mum is like, you know, not as enthusiastic. But the child just thinks that the mum is happy to go too. And kids don't understand this idea just yet, that between the ages of 2 to 7, they don't really understand that actually people around me might not have the same interests as me, okay? And a lot of the time, if the mum says, no, we can't go to Disneyland, the child is absolutely appalled. They're just so in shock because they can't understand how the mum is not on the same page as them. Okay, so that's something, it's not a key accomplishment, but it's kind of a behavior or it's a kind of a behavior that we see in kids that are in the preoperational stage, so between the ages of 2 to 7. And again, egocentrism can influence the other key accomplishments in this stage, which we're going to go through now. So as we went through before, children in the preoperational stage, that is the ages of 2 to 7 years of age, often show a key accomplishment called symbolic thinking. So it's assumed that by the time you reach 7 years of age, you will be able to successfully demonstrate symbolic thinking. That is, being able to use symbols to represent or reflect objects or ideas that are not physically present. Okay, so what that means is a child might take some threads or some, some strips of wool from her mother's sewing box and say, hey, these are noodles. And she might pretend to have noodles with her toy, I don't even know what animal that is. Yeah, with her toy sheep or whatever. Okay, so that's symbolic thinking. In the same way, when you get really big boxes, okay, children might pretend that that's a house or a cave. So symbolic thinking is the ability to use symbols to represent objects that are not physically present. And although as adults we look at this, or, as teenagers you might look at your siblings and say, oh my God, she's so dumb. She thinks that box is a house. Like you were once like that, and at the end of the day, symbolic thinking is actually a cognitive development by itself, because for children of that age, symbolic thinking is kind of proof, or it is an indication that they are developing in a normal cognitive kind of progression, or a normal progression of development there, and that they're not behind or developmentally delayed in that sense. The next kind of key accomplishment of preoperational stage, the ages of 2 to 7 years old, is animism. So animism is this idea that everything that exists has some kind of element of being alive or having some kind of consciousness. And so a lot of the time you might realize that if a child's teddy bear or a child's toy has been ripped apart, or there's like wool coming out of it or something, they will often say, Mummy, my teddy bear's injured, or Mummy, my teddy bear's going to die, or something like that. So they often think of, anything that exists, like any toy, any object they have, has some kind of consciousness there. So if they, for example, bump their leg on a table, they might actually start screaming at the table and be like, bad table, why did you bump me? Now it hurts, or something like that. So they might start even talking to objects, pretending that those objects are actually alive, okay? Because they actually think that, yes, any object that does exist has some kind of consciousness or some kind of element of being alive. So transformation is this idea that something can change from one form to another. So a lot of the time, children by the end of the age of 7, they should be able to understand that ice blocks are the solid form of water, and that if you put them out in the sun or you put them somewhere warm, they will eventually turn into a liquid, which is the water we drink. So that is kind of this understanding that there are various states, and that an object or a substance can actually change from one state to another. So another behavior that we might observe in children in the preoperational stage, that is between the ages of 2 to 7, is centration. So centration is this idea that the child can only see an object or a particular event as having one quality or one feature at a time. So centration comes from the word central, and central means like in the middle, or like it's a main thing. It's a main thing. So if you take a child in this stage of the cognitive development, in the preoperational stage, and you point to the child's father and you say, this is your father, that child will be like, yeah, I know that's my father. But if the mother then comes in and says, that's my husband, the child will be like, no, that's my father. So for the child, it's actually difficult for the child to understand that a person or an object can be more than one thing, or can have more than one purpose. Okay, so for example, another example is if that if the mother is drinking coffee from a mug, and then she uses the same mug as a kind of measuring cup to kind of measure rice or to measure flour because she can't find the actual measuring cup in the kitchen, the child will be like, "Mummy, what are you doing? Why are you using the coffee cup to do that? You're only supposed to use it to drink coffee." So for the child, it's hard for the child to be able to understand that a person or a thing or an event can have more than one purpose or more than one feature. Okay, now centration is very much related to egocentrism because the child only sees things from their point of view or only sees things from their perspective. So that's very relevant for the example of the child saying, "No, that's my father, that's not your husband," to the mother, because the child only sees the father as being his or her father, okay, rather than the fact that the father is also a husband, he's also a brother, is also a son to somebody else. So that is basically what centration is about. And in centration, centration is basically because the child is still pretty young and children will learn the concept of conservation. So conservation is kind of the development. It's the next step that the child goes to from centration. And when they reach conservation, which is in the next stage, they are able to overcome this idea of centration and focus on more than one quality or feature of an object at a time. This is just a little diagram. It's pretty easy to understand, but all it does is kind of explain what centration is, and it kind of links it to the next development in this child's cognitive ability, which will be conservation. Conservation is something that they will develop in the concrete operational stage, okay, which we still haven't started discussing yet. But just read through this explanation. It's pretty easy to understand. So children in the pre-operational stage are still unable to understand conservation. They're still not able to understand that even though the same amount of water is in the first 2 cups in this first picture, and the guy or the researcher is literally pouring the same amount of water into the taller test tube, the kid still thinks that, hey, the taller test tube looks taller, so there's more water in it, okay? So they can't really understand that water can still be the same amount regardless of what object it's poured into, okay? So that's showing you a lack of conservation there. And this problem is actually overcome in the next stage, in the concrete operational stage of the. And one of the last key accomplishments of the pre-operational stage, that is the ages between 2 to 7, is reversibility. So by the end of 7 years of age, a child should be able to show this concept of reversibility, or show this idea that they can mentally think back or mentally follow back a sequence of events to when it started, okay? So we're at point B, how do we get back to point A? They should be able to trace back that sequence of events. Now, children in the pre-operational stage will be able to develop this understanding that something can change and then return to its original condition. So you'll see, like, if you've got a brother or sister and they've left their little Zupa Duper or their icy pole on the bench top and it started to melt, they're like, "Oh my God, it started to melt." They'll go put it back in the freezer because they've developed this understanding that, yes, the icy pole or ice cream has melted, but I can turn it back into solid form if I put it back into the freezer. And again, this is very much related to stuff they start learning in school as well at the ages of 6 and 7 as well. Okay, so that's reversibility, and that is the last kind of key accomplishment we see in the pre-operational stage. So in the next slide, we'll be covering the concrete operational stage, which is the next stage of Piaget's theory of development. Now, the concrete operational stage is kind of the last it's not the last stage, but it's one of the last stages of childhood that actually includes childhood, because it's between the ages of 7 to 12 years, okay? So after this stage, we've got the formal operational stage, but that's more into like when you're a teenager into adulthood. So the concrete operational stage is kind of covering your grades of maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 up to year 12 and beyond that when you go to university. The formal operational stage will cover the ages of 12 and above. So that's basically once you start high school, once you start going to university, whereas the concrete operational stage covers that period of time when you're still in primary school, kind of nearing the end of year 6, maybe the start of year 7. So that kind of age range there. So in this stage, obviously, because the child has been going to school, they're doing all these different subjects, they're doing maths, they're doing English, this child can actually perform mental operations. So they can think about, they can solve maths in their head. So if someone says, okay, what's 2 plus 2? and then they can do it in their head. They don't have to start using their fingers all the time. Okay. And a child can actually perform mental operations that are more complex. So not just maths, but also, for example, they can think about, okay, when I go home, if I do my homework straight away, it will make my mum happy. And my mum will then give me extra dessert after dinner time. So they can actually think about the consequences of something happening without actually doing it. So they can start planning in advance. So basically, in this stage, we also talked about this thing of conservation. So in this stage, children also start to understand this concept of conservation, that certain elements or properties of an object can remain the same even if their appearance changes. So this can be applied to mass, to volume, to length. So using the same example as the previous slide, the child in the third little square picture here, who in the previous stage, in the pre-operational stage, kind of said, actually, you know what, the taller test tube has more water. In this stage, they're not going to fall for that trick. They're going to be like, nope, I saw you pour the water into both those test tubes and they have exactly the same amount. And that is the child showing that they've got this knowledge of conservation. Children can also develop classification skills. So classification is to do with how they classify or group or organize information. So being able to say, okay, that's a lion, that's a cat, that's a tiger. They all belong to, the cat family. So that's something that children can start to do. And again, this is something that's also promoted through what they learn at school. So this is just another kind of diagram. Now, I'll just leave this here for you to look at your own time. All the tasks that are on this slide here, children in the concrete operational stage would be able to complete these tasks. However, children in the pre-operational stage, when Piaget did the original study with these kids, actually failed to complete these tasks correctly. So in other words, children between the ages of 2 to 7 will generally fail at these tasks and will not answer the questions correctly according to what's in this little visual image here. Okay, so I'll just give you that to look at in your own time. You don't have to memorize this or memorize the answers or the questions, just for your own understanding to distinguish between pre-operational, that is the ages of 2 to 7, and concrete operational, which is the ages of 7 to 12, and to see that kind of boost in cognitive development between those two stages. So obviously we mentioned before that in the concrete operational stage, children show classification. So classification is the ability to organize objects or events into categories. So like I mentioned before, a child will say, okay, a cat, a lion and a tiger are all a part of the big cat family or something like that. Okay, they'll be able to sort things out. So if you tip a bag of M&Ms in front of them and you tell them, okay, can you organize this? The first way they might try to organize those M&Ms is by dividing them into, okay, red M&Ms in one pile, green M&Ms in another pile, maybe the yellow M&Ms in another pile. So they're able to organize objects or events into categories based on common features like color, like shape, like size, etc. So that's basically what classification is, organizing information based on common features or qualities that set them apart. So the last stage of Piaget's development of cognitive abilities theory is called the formal operational stage. Formal operational stage is what most of you would be showing right now. And it's something that continues well into adulthood as well. So the formal operational stage is where your thoughts, your ability to make decisions, your ability to plan, your ability to think in your head, visualize ideas, all that stuff becomes much more complex and sophisticated. And again, we talked about the maturation of the frontal lobes. And one of the reasons why children or individuals in this stage, 12 years to adulthood, show better ability to form complex thoughts and all that stuff is because their frontal lobe is maturing a lot more at this age compared to when they were maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years old. Now, Piaget believed that abstract thinking was linked to scientific inquiry. So a lot of your scientific skills of being able to think about abstract concepts, philosophical problems, being able to, problem solve or, respond to certain scientific research investigations, all that stuff was actually seen to be the key accomplishments of the formal operational stage. And so abstract thinking is not just thinking about what is the meaning of life, but it's also about being able to, describe concepts that you can't actually see. So for example, in science class, you're talking about atoms, you're talking about ions, you're talking about all these stuff that you can't actually see materialistically in front of you, but you can still think about how it might happen. Also, students or individuals in this formal operational stage show really good abilities of generating solutions for problems. And so they're able to look at a problem and be like, okay, this is what the person could do to resolve the conflict or to resolve the issue. Okay, one of the reasons for that is because they have better skills of deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is using logic and using these ideas of, that A causes B, or that B is the consequence of A, or whatever, to basically be able to deduce a good solution for a problem, okay? And deductive reasoning also relies on this process of elimination. So eliminating what didn't work and focusing and kind of improving what could work as a solution for a problem. So that's pretty intense stuff, okay? It's not easy. And so it does take you a kind of like higher age range to be able to develop that kind of knowledge and cognitive understanding. The final thing that we're looking at is idealistic thinking. So idealistic thinking is very common in this stage as well. It's comparing others and yourself to a perfect ideal and striving to reach that ideal. So a lot of the time, between the ages of 12 to, well into adulthood, we are thinking about what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of mark do I want to leave on this world? What do I want to leave behind? What's my legacy? All that kind of stuff. So idealistic thinking is really good in the sense that we can think about where do I want to be? What is the perfect image of myself that I would want to achieve? And we can do things to reach that goal or to reach that image of the ideal person or figure that we actually want to be in our lives. So that's pretty abstract as well, because we're actually thinking about something that we haven't become just yet. And the last slide is the criticisms of Piaget's theory. So while Piaget's theory did teach us a lot about the way and in which people cognitively develop through age, and at different stages of the lifespan. And he did tell us about the key accomplishments that people can actually show in each of those stages. There are some limitations or disadvantages or criticisms of his theory. So number one, Piaget was pretty strict in saying that, okay, this happens at this stage of the lifespan, this happens at this age. But we have to remember that different children behave in different ways and different children cognitively develop in various ways. So one child might show animism or symbolic thinking earlier than another child, or one child might show centration a little bit later, but doesn't mean that they're developmentally abnormal. So that was kind of like a concern with his theory. Also, some of the kids in Piaget's study, they weren't exactly top grade children or top grade students or even well behaved, for example. So a lot of children were quite rowdy, they were quite bad behaved in his study, they lost concentration very easily, had very poor attention spans. I mean, Piaget's theory isn't exactly like mind-blowing stuff, like especially for a child. So a lot of the children were kind of getting bored. Piaget, when's recess time? It's so boring. So a lot of the time, these children might have not have paid great attention, and that could have also influenced their ability to do certain tasks, like the conservation task, for example. Also, a lot of the questions in Piaget's study that he used to determine a child's cognitive development were quite wordy, and they probably were not easiest for the children to understand. So this could have been a limitation as well. It's not that the kids were not cognitively ready to answer the question, but that they didn't understand the question itself. Okay. And the final thing that we look at is sample size. So we haven't learned about research methods just yet. That's chapter 1 in your book. But sample size is basically the number of people in a study. So the number of people in Piaget's study wasn't exactly the highest number possible. And so his child participants might not have reflected the general kind of consensus or general kind of behavior in the population. So again, individual differences in children could have influenced the results as well. So his theory, although we still study it to this day, and it is still a really good way to start our understanding of cognitive development, it is not without its flaws or without its limitations. Okay, so just learn at least 2 of the criticisms from this slide for the SAC and you'll be all good. End of this PowerPoint. And basically what I really wanted to go through was kind of what I really wanted to direct your attention to in this PowerPoint is just the fact that this is a quick summary of everything that we've covered in the PowerPoint so far. So if you've got any questions, feel free to message me via the social stream on the class page. If you want to email me, you know my email, it's fmunaf@wicv.net. So fmunaff@wicv.net. And yeah, if you've got any other questions, just feel free to post them on the social stream. Make sure you do your set tasks and upload your questions via the file Dropbox, not the social stream. So there should be a file Dropbox on the class page, which you can upload your questions onto. And that is mandatory submittable work. So I need that work to be submitted. So yeah, basically have a really nice break. Inshallah, keep safe, practice social distancing and make sure that you, don't avoid going out too much. And yeah, just have a really nice break and make sure you do all the work. And I will see you next term, inshallah. Bye.